I'm here to talk about, as part of the EPICS GM Leadership Series. If that's not why you're here, you're welcome to stay, but it may not be what you were expecting. I'm Leah Jameson. I'm going to start by introducing myself to give you some sense of why I'm talking to you about leadership. And so with that, I'm simply going to get started. If you have questions while we go, that's fine. There'll be time for questions at the end. And I would actually like to start by asking, since there are few enough people here, normally this would not be feasible, if you could just introduce yourself. I won't promise to remember your name, I'm sorry. And in a sentence or two, why are you here coming to one of the EPICS GM Leadership Series talks? And whoever wants to start can start.
Hello, my name is Grant. I'm a sophomore in computer science, and I guess the reason why I want to know more about leadership is because I'm a design lead for my EPICS project, so I'd like to be able to be a better leader for them.
Okay, great.
My name is Josh. I'm a junior in mechanical engineering. The reason I'm here is I'm a project manager for an EPICS team, so I want to learn more about leadership, and I have career aspirations to be a leader. So
Okay, great.
hoping this will help me out a little bit.
Okay. I guess we're going in order.
Sure, why not? I'm Austin. I'm actually a freshman in general management, but I'm taking an EPICS course. I'm currently the design lead for our EPICS course. So yeah, I enjoy leadership and have had some leadership experience, and so I want to kind of continue growing in that.
Okay, great.
Hi, I'm Elijah Klein. I'm a junior in computer engineering. I've filled a lot of roles and continue to want to embrace those.
Hi, my name is Chelsea. I'm a sophomore in humanitarian engineering, and I'm also a design lead collector.
Okay.
I'm Evan. I'm a senior in mechanical engineering, also a design lead for my EPICS team, and I came to one of these lectures a couple weeks ago and got a lot out of it, so I came back.
Okay.
Hi, Scott Malloy. I'm a junior in biomedical engineering, and I came to this leadership series mostly because I think we need a lot of strong leaders in the industry, and this is one way to learn what works, what doesn't work.
Okay. And I came prepared, with slides and everything. So I'm Leah Jameson, and this is roughly a chronology of what my career has been. I was an undergraduate in math. For the students who were on the EPICS teams I advise, none of you are here, and they sometimes wonder about how I could know so little about circuits and electromagnetics and things like that. It's because my bachelor's degree was in math. PhD in electrical engineering and computer science at Princeton. Purdue has been my career. I would never have predicted that when I got here, but literally this was my first job, and I have moved through the typical faculty ranks of assistant associate professor, currently a distinguished professor. At some point after becoming a sort of senior professor, was made the director of the graduate program in electrical and computer engineering. And then, along with most of that, I was doing research in speech processing, speech recognition, which is nothing like it is today. The thought that you could talk to your phone was everybody's pipe dream. And also in parallel processing and parallel algorithms, because my background really did split about half and half between electrical engineering and computer science. And at the time, much of what you wanted to do with speech or images, you couldn't do fast enough. And parallel processing was one of the potential ways of being able to envision being able to process things fast enough to make them interesting to people. But in the mid-90s, my career took a pretty dramatic change in direction. I was one of the 3 co-founders of the EPICS program. I'll talk a little bit more about that. Had a short term as interim head of electrical and computer engineering. One head had departed, another one was scheduled to come in. I became the Associate Dean for Undergraduate Education, and then I was the Dean of Engineering for all of engineering at Purdue for 11, 12 years. And I'm back being a faculty member in electrical and computer engineering. I also have a courtesy appointment in engineering education. And what I'm doing as a faculty member, I'm co-advising 2 EPICS teams, the Imagination Station team, the Deaf Kids Code team, and doing things in my department and I'll talk a little bit more about doing some things outside as well. And so that's kind of my Purdue life, Purdue career. There's actually been what I would think of as a sort of parallel career that has had a pretty constant thread throughout the entire time that I've been a professor. I was early on a volunteer in the IEEE Signal Processing Society, eventually became president of the Signal Processing Society, IEEE vice president for technical activities and later for publications, and eventually president of the IEEE. And in the post-IEEE president, but working through many of these things too, have been doing essentially volunteer service with a number of organizations, the National Academy of Engineering, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the National Science Foundation. I'm on the advisory board for Imagination Station, which is the local science center for kids on the other side of the river, sort of that way. And doing a lot of mentoring, especially with colleagues and faculty and some students. The Dean of Engineering and IEEE president happened about the same time. And so, in some sense, there was this path to some kind of leadership roles which converged and created a lot of opportunities, I would say. The other thing I would note is that on this volunteer side of my life, there has been a pretty steady involvement, first as a volunteer in both Purdue, but also national women in technology, women in computing organizations, and ultimately chairing a number of national, and in one case, international women in technology organizations. I will say that none of this was planned. I think probably the question I get asked the most, both from IEEE people and from Purdue people, is, well, what did you do to work towards these fairly significant leadership roles? So if we look at this period from when I became the graduate coordinator in ECE, which was around 1990 and about 5 years before we started EPICS, that's actually over 25 years at this point. But there was nothing about it that I would say in any long horizon sense was ever intentional. So when I hear you saying you're interested in leadership, I think that's really insightful in a case of knowing yourself, and it gives you an incredible way of thinking about this and actually learning about it early on. I would say that the only thing I ever intentionally was aware of planning in my career wasn't when I was in high school. I decided I wanted to be a professor when I grew up. Assuming I went to college, I was going to be a first-generation college student because nobody in my family had ever gone to college. But I really loved school, and as best I could tell, if you got to be a professor, then you got to be in school full-time, all the time, for the rest of your career, for the rest of your life. And so it sounded like a good goal. What did start happening is that both on the Purdue side and on the volunteer side, I would be appointed to committees, because that's something that you're supposed to do as a professor. And it turns out that I was actually pretty good at it. I was organized. I tried to get things done. For the most part, I worked well with people. And I started observing that every time I ended up on a committee, the next thing I knew, I was chairing the committee. And this actually came as a surprise because none of this was planned. But the other thing I discovered was that I actually really enjoyed it. I really liked, and I continue to like, thinking about the contexts in which we do things, thinking about the bigger picture, not just what am I working on today, but where could it go, what could it mean? Thinking about what could be different, thinking about what could change, and then working to make it happen, and discovered that I actually took genuine pleasure both from the success of the whole, not just what I was doing, but the success of whatever it was, but also because these organizations are also always about people, and certainly being in a leadership role in a university, in a school like college, like the College of Engineering, is about people that could find genuine pleasure in the success of others. Is that working with faculty and feeling that in some way had helped create an environment where they could thrive, that was enormously gratifying, and maybe even more gratifying than when I felt like I'd done something myself. And so I think that put me on a path. So what I'm going to do is talk briefly about two examples from my leadership experience. We're going to try closing the Logitech window that tells me that there are great things that Logitech could do for me. And I'm going to start. Okay, so now it's insulted that I closed the Logitech thing. There we go. That's better. I'm going to talk about EPICS because in many ways I would say EPICS was one of the biggest and least expected leadership roles that I found myself in. And you know, what was involved in starting EPICS? It was thinking about imagining doing something different. And it actually grew out of criticisms that industry was firing at colleges of engineering and graduates of engineering programs in the US. That our graduates had great technical skills, they knew nothing about teamwork, they knew nothing about leadership, they communicated badly, didn't seem to have any sense of how they could put what they were working on into a bigger context, not aware of customers, knew nothing about project planning. I'm hoping that this sounds really foreign to you, because the hope is that some things have changed since the early to mid 90s. And a group of faculty sitting around one summer just saying, okay, industry's, publishing op-eds about how engineering programs are not creating what was needed in the industry. And started just brainstorming with a completely blank slate. What would we do differently? And started talking about design teams, where you actually did significant design projects, and in order for them to be significant, they could last more than one semester, that they might last a year or more than a year, and that because some of these skills that industry was so critical of are fairly hard to learn sitting in a one-semester course, that students could actually participate on teams for multiple semesters or multiple years. And it would become kind of an ecosystem of learning not only technical things in engineering, but also learning a lot about how to be on teams, how to do projects, how to be part of a project, how to lead a project, how to communicate about your project. And so we went through a bunch of series of approvals, and we got an okay to offer an experimental course, which was the first semester of EPICS. And there are a lot of things that it turns out went into trying to make that happen, because there were a lot of things that we thought belonged in this that Purdue, and frankly, and it wasn't just Purdue, other universities didn't have as part of how their engineering programs ran. So for example, things that you couldn't do. Give students 24/7 access to labs. Give students purchase authority with approvals, but purchase authority where you could get a credit card, you could check it out, you could go to Menards or Lowe's or Walmart and buy things and come back with your stuff and with the credit card. That you could register for the same class for more than one semester, even if you did well in the class. In fact, maybe even especially because you wanted to keep doing it. But if you have taken EE 302 and you've done well in it, you may not take EE 302 again. It doesn't work that way. Well, EPICS has said, no, students have to be able to come back. And they have to be able to be any year they want to be able to do it. That you could have sections of the same class that were not interchangeable, that if there was a class that has a Monday 1:30 session and a Thursday 9 a.m. session, that as far as the course scheduling at Purdue was concerned, those were interchangeable, and you couldn't actually put a hard request and say, no, I want that one. It would be whatever fit best with your schedule, but also which room was fuller, which one were they having trouble filling. But in the EPICS sense, that would be like saying that the Wabash Center team, it doesn't matter if you're on the Wabash Center team or the Water Resources Management team or the Imagination Station team, they're all interchangeable. I think that one hasn't 100% gone away. It's probably why there is a deadline this Wednesday of doing a Qualtrics survey so that EPICS has insider information about what you want to do. But it's a solution. That projects that were not carefully crafted by a faculty member to exercise exactly these pieces of material from the courses you'd taken could in fact be a legitimate learning experience, that the project came from some outsider who might know anything about engineering at all, but could be turned into a valuable engineering project. And that placing Purdue equipment, for example, a Purdue computer, into the community to be used not for Purdue business, not by Purdue students, but for some community, or that was okay, and that this was not a breach of some kind of financial contract. By doing that, I'm hoping these sound absurd to you. But at the time, they weren't absurd, and so if I think about this from a leadership perspective, things that mattered were persistence and persuasiveness, some amount of confidence that it was worth fighting for, but also collaboration and strength in numbers, because the first semester that we did this, there were 3 of us. There were 5 teams. We 3 co-advised all 5 teams because none of us thought we knew what we were doing, and at least if there were 3 of us in the room, we stood a chance at coming up with appropriate answers to all the questions that the students had. And then, it got approved for a second semester, and we were on our way. The second leadership example I'd like to just talk briefly about is actually IEEE, because it's very, very different. So I had this series of IEEE leadership roles, ultimately IEEE president. IEEE has 400,000 members in 136 countries in the world. It is a very large, very complex organization. The president has a lot of potential roles, and it varies by president what it actually looks like. You can be the board chair, which means you run meetings and you set agendas and you try to work through a whole bunch of committees to make things happen. You can be an ambassador. There have been presidents who have tried to go to as many of 136 countries as they could in a year. That was hard to do when you were also Dean of Engineering at Purdue. It was not a good match. You could think about being a change agent. You have a 1-year term. You're president-elect for a year, you're past president for the year. So you have a 3-year window, 1 year of which you are in charge. And it's a volunteer job, it's not your day job. And so the question is, what can you do with this? It's large and complex. But in terms of becoming a leader, you climb through the ranks, so very similar. You build a lot of relationships. with volunteers, but also with staff. You actually end up working with people of all ages, from all cultures, from all life experiences, different work experiences, reasons for being there. And for me, and so this is about 12 years after EPICS started, what was absolutely key was, having been a volunteer for a long time, building a sense of what things are challenges for IEEE, where are there opportunities for IEEE. And so I spent most of my time focusing on things like, how do you break down discipline silos? And it's not so much mechanical and electrical, but within electrical engineering, IEEE has 44 societies. Came out of the Signal Processing Society, and also some of the, but there's a lasers and electro-optics, there's Engineering and Management Society, there's Biomedical Engineering Society. How do you break down the disciplines? And the example at the time was that wireless was probably the single hottest technical topic and commercial topic that there was. IEEE had no obvious home for wireless. And so little wireless pods were popping up all over IEEE with no communication, more competition than coordination. And what do you do about that? And the other thing that was hitting it around that time is that in the US, engineering enrollments were dropping. And there was a sense that the public did not understand what engineering was. Teachers didn't have much of a sense of when to advise kids to become engineer. Parents didn't know what it meant. Other than that, there was a very good sense that you had to be good in math and science, and you would probably have a good job with a good salary. So that was okay. But it meant that there were opportunities to think about, how are we organized technically? What are we doing about this question of public visibility? And IEEE is also where I found part of my professional thinking home, which is that I really, really like strategy and strategic planning and envisioned futures and thinking about what can be. And so we spent time on that. IEEE's tagline is today, and has been since 2007, advancing technology for the benefit of humanity. And so it was an opportunity to think about, how do we talk about engineering? How do we perhaps nudge how people think about engineering? And what was interesting about this is that I became dean around the same time, and a lot of the components were actually very similar. There are structural differences. You're not president for 1 year. I was dean for 11 years. It was a full-time job, not a part-time volunteer job. But a lot of the questions were the same. It's like, how are people going to learn in the future? How are publications going to, and this was the very early days of electronic publications, so what are publications going to look like? What does it mean to be global? Because IEEE was, universities were working on figuring it out. How are you going to identify emerging fields? How can you know that wireless is going to be the next big thing before it becomes the next big thing? Because that's important at a university as well as to a professional society. And so this notion of thinking about change, trying to think about vision and strategy, was absolutely critical for the College of Engineering in the same way that it was for IEEE. In a university, in a large college, it is absolutely essential that that be a shared vision. So how do you create a shared vision when you have 360 faculty and ultimately you're growing to 460 faculty over a short period of time? How do you develop shared vision? But so a lot of the same questions. Where are the opportunities? How do you find them? What's going to be important? How do you communicate about change? But how do you make it a change that is actually enthusiastic, that is going to, people are going to want to run with? And along the way, it turns out I learned some skills. From IEEE, I learned about budgets. So when I became dean, I knew what budgets look like. You're learning about budgets. This is good because a lot of people never learn about budgets. And strategic planning, and how to build consensus. So I'm going to step back and just briefly talk about a couple of models. And this one in particular has turned out to be incredibly valuable for me as I think about leadership and to remind myself when I'm in a leadership role. So Frank Green, whose picture is there, is a Purdue master's degree in electrical engineering in 1962. He became a serial entrepreneur. He was a founding partner of New Vista Capital in the San Francisco Bay Area. It focused on providing venture capital to minorities and women. In 2001, he was recognized as one of the 25 most influential blacks in technology. He's in the Silicon Valley Hall of Fame. He started something called the Green Scholars Program, which worked with K-12 schools to bring science, engineering, and math initiatives to schools that were frankly not very good schools, and kids weren't getting a very good education because these were mostly inner city kids. He created this notion of leadership, which he called VRE, standing for Vision, Relationships, and Execution. And he brought this to these inner city kids in San Jose, California, as a way of thinking about their future, and that they could be leaders, and that they could have a vision, and they could make things happen, and that you needed relationships to do it. The other thing he did, though, is because he was a Purdue alum, he would visit back here occasionally. He brought this to EPICS as well as a lecturer in the leadership series. And we started working with him, and to Purdue as well. So this is someone who, he said that there are a lot of really complicated leadership models out there. The reason he settled on this vision, relationships, execution is because he really wanted something that kids who perhaps weren't sure what kind of future they had would be able to grasp and run with and understand. And I think those are the reasons I like it, because it is easy to understand, but also because I think it captures incredible amounts of what has turned out, I think, to be valuable. I'll mention one other model. It's not a model, but it is an approach to leadership, because I'm pretty much in awe of what it is and how it worked, and not always worked, is that Doris Kearns Goodwin wrote a biography of a part of Abraham Lincoln's career. Won a Pulitzer Prize for History in 2005. And it was called Team of Rivals. And so the picture on the right, those were all of the contenders for the Republican presidential nomination in 1860. And for those of you who thrive on politics, the designations of the parties have changed a lot. The Republican Party then is not the same as the Republican Party now. There have been lots of things in between. But literally, that was the field of candidates for the, quote, primary for this. Lincoln is in the third row, second from the left. He won the party's nomination. He won the election and became president. And what he started doing once he became president was pulling in some of these people who had argued so vehemently with him to be in his cabinet. So, for example, William Seward, who's the big one in the middle, and I'm not quite sure why he was so prominent in the picture, was appointed Secretary of State under Lincoln. If you have heard or learned about Seward's Folly, which was the purchase of Alaska from the Russians, that was the Seward. He was Secretary of State. The top left is Edward Bates, who became Attorney General. The second row, second from the left, is Salman Chase, was appointed Secretary of the Treasury, ultimately became Chief Justice.